How much of the history we know is the truth, and how much of it is just a mirror that has been bent and distorted? The stories we grew up learning in school, are they really the honest memory of humanity, or just a version carefully chosen by those in power? All around us there are still civilizations that vanished without explanation, texts that were burned, and empty stretches of time called Dark Ages. Why did once great empires like the Hittites, the Olmecs, or the Etruscans crumble into nothing more than fragments for archaeologists to dig up? And why do these questions always seem to be pushed aside? If history is truly a tool that shapes both the present and the future, then perhaps we are living inside a version of the truth that has already been rewritten. Tonight on Bedtime History, let us shine a light into those dark corners and ask ourselves, is history really the shared memory of humanity, or simply a story repeated over and over across the centuries? When we look at any civilization from east to west, we realize that the question, who writes history, is just as important as the events themselves. Events can be chaotic, unclear, and unpredictable, but words can be selected, shaped, and framed into a fixed order. And once those words are recorded, carved on stone tablets, written in chronicles, or bound into massive histories, they almost automatically become the truth in our collective memory. Think about it. Every empire had its official record keepers, court historians, or chroniclers whose job was to tell the story of the dynasty. They did not simply record battles and rulers, they also crafted images, choosing which glories deserved to be celebrated and which defeats should be hidden away. In the Chinese imperial courts, historians stood in a precarious position. If they were too honest, they could face punishment. If they were too biased, future generations of historians could condemn them. In the West, Rome had the same tradition. The chronicles of the empire often turned bitter defeats into strategic withdrawals, while enemies were painted as barbaric and uncivilized, all to highlight the brilliance of Rome. This power was not only in the hands of emperors, but also in the hands of religion and intellectual institutions. When the Bible was compiled and revised over centuries, every word and every passage was chosen not only for spiritual devotion, but also to establish a spiritual and political order. Texts that did not fit were cast aside, burned, leaving future generations with a canon, a so-called official version that many forget was only one choice among countless possibilities. The same is true with the writings of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the texts of Hindu traditions. They all reveal the same truth. Collective memory is never neutral. It is always edited, always influenced by power. When one empire triumphed, history was written from the viewpoint of the victor. What did not fit was cast into shadow, dismissed as trivial or unreliable. We know Hannibal mostly through the pages of Rome, but we know almost nothing of him through the eyes of Carthage, because Carthaginian records barely survived. We hear of Alexander's conquests, but rarely of the chaos and suffering endured by the lands he invaded. Even archaeology, when it speaks through broken pottery and ruined walls, must rely on the interpretations of scholars, and those scholars are themselves shaped by the politics and culture of their own time. So we must ask a fundamental question: is humanity's memory truly objective, or is it the result of a chain of deeply subjective choices? When we read a history book, are we looking at the truth or at a carefully arranged mosaic? Every time we call an era a dark age, every time we label a people as barbarians, how much of that is fact and how much of it is simply an imposed perspective? The 20th century gave us many vivid examples of this rewriting of memory. Dictatorships used school textbooks as tools, turning history into propaganda to secure power. Wars were fought not only on the battlefield, but also in the pages of education, where the image of us was polished clean while the enemy was vilified. This shows us that the power to control history does not just decide how a nation understands its past, it also shapes its beliefs, its identity, and even the choices of its future. So then, can we really say that human memory is, in some sense, always a copy, a transcript edited over and over again? And if our memory has been controlled and molded, what should we believe in? Is history the truth, or is it only the shards of a broken mirror pieced together into a picture just clear enough for us to keep living with? To answer those questions, let us look into the shadows where once great civilizations suddenly disappeared, leaving behind only silence, as if they had been deliberately erased from our collective memory. When a people no longer remain to tell their own story, when their language and symbols are buried beneath stone and earth, their history instantly becomes a void. And in that void, later generations can only fill the silence with theories and fragments passed down from the victors. It is in this emptiness that darkness covers human memory, and their silence turns into a mystery never truly resolved. Imagine the Olmec civilization in Central America, who carved enormous stone heads with striking and unfamiliar features. The Olmec left behind no detailed texts, no long chronicles. All we can guess is that they may have been the mother culture of the Americas, paving the way for the Maya and the Aztec, who came later. Yet they vanished almost without a trace, leaving behind a haunting question. How could a society with organized cities, art, religion, and ceremonial systems collapse so abruptly? The stone heads that still lie deep in the jungles stand as silent witnesses, unable to tell us the real story of what happened. Farther east, the Indus Valley civilization built cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, complete with advanced drainage systems and astonishing urban planning. They traded with Mesopotamia, crafted intricate jewelry, and left behind a script that has never been fully deciphered. And yet their world also collapsed. Some believe it was floods, climate change, or long conflicts that forced them to abandon their cities. Whatever the reason, the greatest loss was their memory. No texts to explain, no voices to pass down the story. Everything became a secret buried in the soil. These vanished civilizations are not just the final chapters of history. They are reminders that human history has never been a smooth and straight line. On the contrary, it is full of breaks, fractures, and dark, empty spaces. It is not only when civilizations collapse that a void opens in humanity's memory. Even within the heart of empires that endured, there were stretches of time where history seemed to be covered by a heavy fog. These are what people call the Dark Ages, eras where the light of knowledge, art, and progress seemed to have faded away. But did these Dark Ages truly exist, or were they simply the product of a deliberate way of telling history? Let us begin with Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. Textbooks often describe a long period of stagnation where cities crumbled, literacy disappeared, trade came to a halt, and people lived under the shadow of war, disease, and superstition. This image has been passed down to generations, a bleak, ruined world waiting for the light of the Renaissance to return. Yet increasingly historians have begun to ask, was that darkness real, or was it a label created to highlight the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance? Archaeological evidence suggests that even during these so-called dark centuries, vibrant centers of culture and streams of knowledge still existed. European monasteries preserved and copied thousands of manuscripts. The Byzantine Empire maintained a complex administration and a tradition of Greco-Roman scholarship. The Islamic world was flourishing at the same time, becoming a bridge that carried mathematics, medicine, and astronomy forward. Clearly, the so-called Dark Ages were not a universal age of darkness, but rather a perspective framed from the Western seat of power. And then, from the discussion of these dark ages, we encounter an even more controversial idea, the phantom time hypothesis. Put forward by German historian Heribert Illig in the late 20th century, this theory claims that nearly 300 years of European history, specifically from about 614 to 911, never actually happened. Illig argued that figures like Charlemagne may have been fictional, invented to fill in the missing centuries, and that the year 1000 of the Common Era was in reality closer to the year 700. If that were true, then we are living in a timeline that has been artificially stretched, with an entire third of a millennium, nothing more than an illusion. At first glance, the phantom time hypothesis sounds like an outlandish conspiracy, yet it forces us to pause and reflect. For the real question Illig raised was not simply, did those 300 years exist, but how can we be certain that the chronologies, the annals, and the recorded dates truly reflect the passage of time? Carbon dating, archaeology, and astronomical records have all been cited to challenge Illig's claims. But the very existence of such a hypothesis reveals a deeper unease, that humanity's memory might be flawed from the very foundations, from the way we measure time itself. Imagine for a moment, if 300 years were indeed added in, that would mean entire chains of events, entire eras we are taught in school, could be pure invention. Even if the phantom time hypothesis is not accepted by most scholars, it still opens a door of thought. History is not a perfect encyclopedia, but a patchwork map, with pieces that may be stretched or compressed. What is more unsettling is that time gaps are not unique to Europe. Many civilizations left behind their own blurred centuries. In China, the records of the Three Kingdoms contain disputed numbers and questionable accounts. Ancient Indian dynasties have centuries told, mostly through legend, difficult to verify through archaeology. Even in Mesoamerica, there are stretches of Maya history where inscriptions fall silent, leaving us only to speculate about what happened. Perhaps the most important question is not whether the phantom time hypothesis is right or wrong, but how cautious we must be when placing our trust in history's timeline. For just one small shift in chronology, one gap filled with imagination, could completely alter the way we understand the past, and with it, the present. Yet chronology is not the only fragile thing. Gaps in time may cause us to doubt the continuity of history, but the destruction of written records robs humanity of its most precious fragments of memory. History is not only preserved in artifacts, but also in words, the place where voices, thoughts, and human memory are stored. And when those words are burned, when libraries collapse into flames, history loses not only its data, but also its very soul. We often hear of the Library of Alexandria as the great symbol of such loss, the image of a vast treasury of knowledge gathering texts from across the Mediterranean and beyond, going up in flames and turning into ash, has become an unhealed wound in the imagination of humankind. Scholars still debate the library's true scale and the different fires that may have destroyed it, but one fact is beyond dispute. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of papyrus scrolls were lost. And with them, countless insights into mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and ancient philosophy disappeared forever. We will never know if those scrolls contained theories that might have changed the way we understand the world. But Alexandria was not the only tragedy. In China, under the reign of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, a campaign of burning books and burying scholars was carried out, meant to erase writings that clashed with the new political order. Classic works, historical records, treatises on philosophy and medicine were turned into ash, leaving later generations only fragments from which to reconstruct a dim outline. In Central America, when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they burned nearly all of the Maya books, codices made of bark that recorded history, astronomy, and religion. Out of thousands of volumes, only 4 survive today. That means the greater part of the knowledge, the memory, and the identity of an entire civilization was erased from humanity's record. Every time a library burns, every time a book is thrown into the fire, we lose more than words. We lose the questions our ancestors once asked, the alternative ways they viewed the world. We lose the ability to compare, to challenge, and sometimes to refute the official stories. For when only one version survives, the version approved by rulers, our collective memory is confined to a narrow frame, appearing complete yet hollow within. What makes this silence even more frightening is that it often leaves no trace at all. When a city falls, we can still uncover its walls, its pottery, its archaeological remains. But when a book turns to ash, it disappears completely. There is nothing left to unearth, nothing left to reconstruct. That silence is absolute, and a dimension of human memory is lost forever. And so we are left to wonder, if those texts had survived, would the history we learn today look entirely different? Could scientific theories, philosophical ideas, or records of forgotten civilizations have reshaped our understanding of humanity's origin and destiny? We will never know, and that is the tragedy of silence in the ashes. After the flames consumed libraries and turned manuscripts into ash, a question rises clearly before us. Who holds the power to decide what is remembered and what must be forgotten? For history, as we usually know it, has never been an objective mirror reflecting the whole past. It is an image filtered, edited, and shaped in the hands of those who hold political, religious, or scholarly authority. The price of controlling collective memory is not only the loss of diversity in stories, but also the creation of an official history, a version of the past carefully edited, painted, and imposed upon generations. What is the cost of this? First, history loses its polyphony. Instead of a choir of many voices, we are left with a single melody chosen for us. Instead of seeing the world through many lenses, we are forced to look through one narrow window. That produces a sense of certainty, but in truth, it impoverishes our understanding. A society with only one past to believe in will struggle to question, to verify, and will be easily guided in the direction chosen by those in power. Second, controlling memory also means imposing an identity on future generations. A people taught that they were once the center of civilization, that they carried a historic mission, will grow up with a powerful belief, one that can be both a source of pride and a set of chains. Each generation raised within such a narrative inherits either deep pride or deep shame, depending on the story they are told. And so collective memory does not only reflect the past, but becomes a tool to shape the present and the future. Third, the price is also paid in trust. When one day suppressed documents are uncovered, when the truth turns out to be different from what we were taught, confidence in the entire structure of history begins to shake. This happened more than once in the 20th century when forgotten texts were unearthed, forcing people to ask, why were they hidden? Who decided that we should not know them? And when those questions echo, they are not aimed at a single document, but at the very concept of official history itself. We might say that official is simply another word for the version that power allowed to survive, and the cost of hearing only the victor's story is imbalance in humanity's memory. Forgotten civilizations, burned manuscripts, unexplained gaps in time, all merge into a shadowed zone where truth may once have existed, but can never be fully recovered. This leads us to an unsettling thought. Could the official history we learn, read, and trust be nothing more than a polished shell? A shell buffed to hide the cracks, the silenced voices, the echoes that were cut short. And if that is the case, can we ever truly believe in the objectivity of a line written in a history book? The question grows heavier when we look at once great civilizations whose past has been retold, in ways convenient for those who followed. A prime example is Egypt, where pyramids, sphinxes, and hieroglyphs should tell the original story, but over time they have been turned into myths. From the time of Greece and Rome, Egypt was already being turned into myth. Greek philosophers saw it as the cradle of wisdom, the school of mankind. They traveled to Memphis, Thebes, and Alexandria to study mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Yet while they honored Egypt as the source of knowledge, they also appropriated those achievements, weaving them into the heritage of Greece and Rome. And once the Greeks wrote about Egypt, it no longer appeared as an independent civilization, but as a supporting role in the Western story of enlightenment. Egyptian monuments, in this way, became props in a larger play, where Greece and Rome took center stage. With the spread of Christianity, Egypt was given yet another role. Temples and statues of ancient gods were seen as symbols of paganism that had to be erased. Christian monks destroyed many statues, converted temples into churches, and painted over ancient reliefs. Slowly, Egypt's memory was no longer that of a people who had built an empire lasting millennia. Instead, it became evidence of the vanity and downfall of polytheistic faith, highlighting the triumph of the new religion. Once again, monuments were used as tools, this time as instruments of theology. In the modern era, especially from the 18th and 19th centuries, Egypt was reborn in the Western imagination through the wave of Egyptology. But Egyptology was never only about science, it was deeply entangled with colonialism. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought not only soldiers but also hundreds of scholars. They surveyed, measured, drew, and published the monumental Description de l'Égypte. Yet the outcome was not simply knowledge, it turned Egypt into intellectual property of the West, as if the pyramids and temples had merely been waiting for Europeans to discover, decode, and claim them. Here we see clearly the price of memory under control. Modern Egyptians were often pushed aside in the telling of their own ancestors' story. Museums in Paris, London, and Berlin overflow with mummies, statues, and inscriptions as though the memory of Egypt no longer belonged to its own land, but to a global heritage owned by the West. And when the public encounters Egypt through exhibitions, films, or tourism, they rarely see a living people. Instead, they see a mystical land, a stage for Western romantic or commercial imagination. Throughout this process, Egypt's grand monuments, originally built to embody power, faith, and wisdom, were stripped of their original meaning. New interpretations were laid upon them, serving foreign narratives. They became proof of Greek Enlightenment, symbols of defeated paganism, and later, backdrops for Hollywood movies and luxury tourist brochures. Yet behind all this, what is most haunting is the silence of local voices. The farmer living in the shadow of the pyramid is never asked what his ancestors believed when they built it. Ordinary Egyptians rarely had the chance to rewrite their own story, hidden under layers of outside myths and interpretations. And this raises a larger question. If Egypt, a mighty civilization whose monuments still stand after 4,000 or 5,000 years, could be turned into a tool, then how much truth remains for smaller civilizations, with fewer ruins and weaker voices? That question leads us to another striking example, the Hittites, a Bronze Age superpower once equal to Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, who then disappeared almost entirely from humanity's memory for thousands of years. In the grand picture of the Bronze Age, we often hear of Egypt with its pyramids, Babylon with its hanging gardens, or Mycenae with the legends of the Iliad. Yet few know that there was another empire that once stood shoulder to shoulder with these names, the Hittite Empire. They were one of the 4 great superpowers of the ancient world, holding unmatched strength in the realms of military, diplomacy, and culture. And yet, paradoxically, for centuries, the name of the Hittites vanished from human memory, only rediscovered by chance through archaeological discoveries in the late 19th century. The Hittites once controlled a vast territory stretching across Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, into Syria, and at times even threatening Egypt itself. They were the direct opponents of Pharaoh Ramesses II in the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest military clashes of the ancient world. At the end of that battle, the Hittites and the Egyptians signed a peace treaty, the oldest known bilateral diplomatic agreement in human history. This demonstrates that the Hittites were not only a military giant, but also a civilization capable of sophisticated diplomacy. And yet their power was not enough to preserve them in collective memory. Around the 12th century before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire collapsed, likely due to a combination of natural disasters, famine, pressure from the so-called Sea Peoples, and internal conflict. Cities were abandoned, and their writing, a unique form of cuneiform, fell into obscurity. For centuries afterward, the name of the Hittites disappeared from historical records. The Greeks did not mention them, Rome left no memory of them, and medieval scholars had no idea that an empire of such scale had ever existed. Even when the Bible referred to the Hittites, many European scholars during the Renaissance and the early modern period assumed it was speaking of a small, insignificant tribe scattered in Canaan. They could not imagine that these references were pointing to a superpower that had once stood as Egypt's equal. It was only in the late 19th century when archaeologists excavated the ruins of Boghazköy, modern-day Hattusa, that clay tablets inscribed with Hittite writing began to reveal their secrets, and from those ruins an empire once mighty returned to human knowledge, late but with undeniable weight. The disappearance of the Hittites raises a troubling question. How can a superpower vanish completely from humanity's memory? Is it because collective memory tends to preserve only what is told again and again, while what is interrupted gradually fades into darkness? Or is it the result of official history being shaped by certain centers of power, Egypt, Greece, Rome, while everything else was pushed to the margins, growing dim with time? This shows us clearly that the history we know is not the whole truth. It is like a book missing many chapters, some of which were once critical to the story. The Hittites are living proof that human memory can be silently edited, not because someone deliberately erased it, but because there was simply no one left to tell it. And once that memory was lost, it created a vast shadow, a gap that humanity only began to fill thousands of years later. Fragility in memory does not only come from forgotten civilizations. Even empires that endured for centuries were not free from shadows in their past. Ancient China is a striking example, a civilization that never disappeared, with the longest continuous tradition of historical writing in the world. Official chronicles compiled dynasty after dynasty. And yet behind the seemingly unbroken layers of text, there remain hazy voids, periods where records were lost, erased, or rewritten, leaving future generations with a memory that is at once full and strangely incomplete. It was not only the Qin dynasty that manipulated memory, but many of the dynasties that followed. Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, the first great history of China, was not only a collection of events, but also a reflection of the author's perspective, his beliefs, and even his personal bitterness. Later, the official histories, such as the Book of Han, the Book of Tang, or the History of Song, all followed the same principle. Each dynasty wrote about the one before it, often glorifying itself and diminishing its predecessor. Because of this, periods of turmoil such as the Spring and Autumn era, the Warring States, or the Northern and Southern dynasties were recorded through biased lenses full of contradictions and omissions. A clear example is the Three Kingdoms period. The records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou became the official account, but it was heavily shaped by the Wei dynasty's influence. Figures such as Liu Bei and Sun Quan were mentioned, but never portrayed as they later appeared in literature. Much of the original material was lost, and what survives today is mixed with later invention. As a result, the Three Kingdoms that we know are less a reflection of original sources than a fusion of history and legend, shaped more by fiction than fact. The greatest losses, however, lie in the times when records were completely broken. The Western Zhou dynasty, for example, left behind very little writing, mostly oracle bone inscriptions and bronze vessel carvings. Historians can only reconstruct fragments from these remnants. Even more obscure is the period before the Xia dynasty, regarded by the Chinese as the first dynasty. The figures of Yu the Great taming the floods, the Yellow Emperor, Yao and Shun appear in the Book of Documents or the Classic of Mountains and Seas, but no archaeological proof exists to confirm them. Were these real rulers, or myths constructed later to create a sense of continuity in national memory? There is another paradox. The more writing a civilization produces, the more it risks losing. When thousands upon thousands of texts exist, one fire, one war, or one act of censorship can erase entire traditions. Chinese history has witnessed many such disasters, from the Qin army burning the capital Xianyang to the fall of the Ming dynasty when many ancient archives were destroyed. Even in the 20th century, during times of upheaval, countless ancient books continued to vanish. Each loss deepened the cracks in the historical record, leaving gaps that may never be filled. This is why when we look at ancient China, we see not only a continuous civilization but also deep fractures in its memory. It is a memory that is both dense and fragile. Dense because of the sheer volume of written history, yet fragile because each dynasty had the power to select, rewrite, and erase. And from that fragility we recognize a familiar truth, whether it is China, Egypt, or the Hittites. All civilizations have shared the same fate. Human memory is not always blurred by time alone. More often it is reshaped by people themselves, through power, through politics, and through interests. This leads us to another question. Beyond official texts and chronicles, where else can we find witnesses of the past? The answer lies in the ghost cities, places that once flourished and then fell into silence, leaving only ruins for later generations to uncover. One of these was Ugarit, a thriving port city on the coast of Syria at the end of the Bronze Age. From here, goods, languages, and cultures flowed between Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the wider Mediterranean world. Ugarit is especially remarkable for developing an early form of alphabetic writing, a turning point in the history of human language. Yet around 1200 before the Common Era, the city suddenly collapsed. Clay tablets record desperate pleas for help sent to the Hittite king, but no reply ever came. Ugarit was burned to the ground and fell silent. Who destroyed it? Many theories point to the mysterious Sea Peoples, but to this day their true identity remains unknown. Ugarit, once a beacon of trade and knowledge, became a ghost city where silence speaks louder than words. Farther south in Asia, Mohenjo-Daro, the jewel of the Indus Valley civilization, was another ghost city of staggering scale. Built with sophisticated urban planning, it had grid-like streets, advanced drainage systems, public wells, and even a great bath for communal life. But around 1900 before the Common Era, the Indus civilization declined, and Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned. There is no evidence of a great war, no signs of a single catastrophic disaster. Theories range from climate change, shifting rivers, to economic decline. But the truth remains hidden. What we do know is that a city of tens of thousands of people vanished, leaving behind empty houses and silent streets, as if its people walked away quietly, never to return. Across the ocean in North America, Cahokia rose as the largest urban center north of Mexico between 1050 and 1350 of the Common Era. With a population estimated in the tens of thousands, Cahokia was home to massive earthen mounds, still standing today, that supported temples, elite residences, and ceremonial centers. It was a hub of trade, connecting vast regions of the continent. And yet, Cahokia, too, disappeared. Its people abandoned the city, leaving only the silent mounds behind. The causes are debated: resource depletion, internal conflict, climate change, or disease. But no one knows for certain. Like Ugarit and Mohenjo-Daro, Cahokia became a ghost city, where the structures remain but the people are gone. What is strange is that although these three cities stood on three different continents, they share certain patterns. First, their disappearances were never fully recorded in writing, leaving later generations only fragments and guesses. Second, they were once vibrant centers, not minor villages, which means their collapse left vast holes in humanity's memory. And third, they remind us that stability is only an illusion. Even the brightest centers can turn into ruins in the blink of historical time. These ghost cities remind us that memory is not only erased by human hands, through book burning, censorship, or rewriting, but also by forces of nature and upheavals beyond human control. And when that happens, history leaves us with a void, a question without an answer. What is more thought-provoking is that every time a city vanishes, the story told about it is usually reconstructed through someone else's lens. Ugarit is remembered through the texts left in its ruins, but the tale of its fall is still told largely through Hittite and Egyptian records. Mohenjo-Daro survives in our imagination as a lost civilization because it left no written voice of its own. Cahokia was ignored for centuries in mainstream Western history and has only recently begun to be recognized. And once again, we return to the same haunting question. If even such flourishing centers could disappear, how much of the history we believe is truly the truth? Or is much of it nothing more than fragments, stitched together just enough to form a convincing story? If the fall of cities such as Ugarit, Mohenjo-Daro, or Cahokia created a silence born from time itself, then the control of memory by religion created a different kind of silence, an intentional one. Unlike natural disasters or epidemics, religious intervention was a systematic restructuring where spiritual authority blended with political power to turn history into a tool that was both sacred and worldly. Here we see an undeniable truth. Religion did not only rewrite memory of the otherworldly, it also shaped the memory of this world. From the earliest days of Christianity, the story of the past was carefully chosen. When the Council of Nicaea and later many other councils took place, dozens of religious texts were rejected and many unofficial gospels were pushed aside. Instead of a wide mosaic, Christianity built collective memory on the foundation of 4 canonical gospels. Other texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, or Judas, were labeled dangerous, even heretical. They did not disappear entirely, but were hidden away in the desert, forgotten until they were rediscovered at Nag Hammadi thousands of years later. And this silence created a standard version of religious memory, which then spread into becoming the standard history of an entire civilization. In the Middle East, Islam also demonstrated its power to shape memory. Immediately after the Prophet Muhammad's death, the revelations were compiled, refined, and standardized into the Quran. Along with this process, many variants, alternative accounts, and oral traditions were excluded. The Quran became not only the heart of faith, but also the center of collective memory. Other traditions and stories, while they may have existed, gradually faded into the background. Religion here was not just a guide for the soul, it was a framework for shaping the past, present, and future of the community. This was not unique to the Abrahamic faiths. In India, Hinduism preserved memory through epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, while at the same time marginalizing or erasing other versions. The Vedas were considered sacred and eternal, but in reality they too had passed through centuries of oral transmission, revision, and selection. In China, when Buddhism entered, it did not bring only doctrine but also a new way of looking at the past, which was then integrated into the cultural memory system. What do all these examples share in common? They reveal that collective memory was sacralized, wrapped in a divine glow that made people stop asking questions. Once a story was stamped as the word of God, the word of the Buddha, or the word of the saints, it was no longer just a fragment of memory, it became absolute truth. And once memory was locked inside the absolute, there was no more room for debate, no more space for alternative voices. Religion, through its spiritual strength, created a kind of orthodoxy more enduring than any empire. For if an empire fell, its walls might crumble, but religious faith lived on inside people's hearts, continuing to tell the story in a single version. This is why memory shaped by religion has such enduring power, surviving across borders and through centuries. But the cost of this endurance was the loss of diversity. When only one version remained, other versions, potentially containing different truths, were lost forever. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library or the Dead Sea Scrolls was not only an archaeological event, but also a reminder that collective memory was once far more diverse. That diversity was suppressed to create a unity that served both religious and political authority. The question that remains is this: if memory could be rewritten by religion, then in the other centers of power during the Middle Ages, where empires and religions intertwined, how was memory shaped there? To answer this, we must turn to Byzantium and the early Islamic world, where the preservation and restructuring of memory became the foundation for an entire era. Byzantium, with its capital at Constantinople, was one of the great fortresses of Greco-Roman memory. While Western Europe fractured into small kingdoms, Byzantium maintained a centralized administration, a strong military, and most importantly, a tradition of scholarship that endured. Greek and Roman manuscripts were copied and preserved in libraries and monasteries. Byzantine scholars continued to teach philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Byzantium stood as a bridge carrying classical knowledge forward into Renaissance Europe. In other words, without Byzantium, many fragments of Greco-Roman memory might have been lost forever. Parallel to Byzantium, another powerful center of memory and learning rose, the Islamic world. After the 7th century, within just a few decades, Islam expanded from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa, West Asia, and even into Spain. On this foundation, a new age of knowledge began, what we now call the Islamic Golden Age. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, was established, where scholars translated thousands of works from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions into Arabic. Through this effort, texts that Western Europe had forgotten were preserved and expanded upon in the Islamic world. Names such as al-Khwarizmi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Alhazen did more than safeguard classical knowledge, they expanded it. Mathematics advanced with algebra and trigonometry. Medicine was organized into encyclopedias that guided healing for centuries. Astronomy laid the groundwork for later observations by Copernicus. The Islamic world became the epicenter of global knowledge, and Greco-Roman memory survived within humanity largely because of these translations and commentaries. Even during the European Middle Ages, when the West seemed locked inside feudal castles, beams of knowledge slipped through the cracks from the east. The earliest European universities, such as Bologna and Paris, absorbed knowledge through Latin translations of Arabic texts. Many European thinkers, including Thomas Aquinas, drew deeply from Avicenna and Averroes. This shows us that humanity's memory never truly disappears, it only changes its course, flowing through channels that often lie outside the vision of those in power. And yet here we must face another truth. Even in the act of preservation and transmission, memory is reshaped. A text translated from Greek to Arabic, then from Arabic to Latin, was never entirely faithful to the original. Each stage carried the interpretation of its time, its scholar, and its cultural context. A line of philosophy could shift in tone, a mathematical formula could be expressed differently, and an idea about the cosmos could be reframed. Memory was preserved, but never intact. It became like a painting copied again and again. The form remained, but the colors and details changed. And in this shifting of currents, a deeper question emerges. If classical knowledge, often celebrated as the foundation of Western civilization, only survived because it was preserved in Byzantium and the Islamic world, then who truly owns humanity's memory? Could it be that the very concept of Western heritage is itself just one version of history, one that overlooks the immense role of other centers? This leads us to another dimension, where the control of memory was no longer confined to libraries, dynasties, or religions, but extended to the entire map of the world. Exploration, cartography, and the stories built upon them reshaped how humanity understood the earth itself. And among these stories, few are as controversial or haunting as the voyages of Columbus and the forbidden maps said to guide him. In our collective memory, Columbus often appears as the pioneer, the discoverer of the New World, in 1492. The official story comes with a familiar image. Before Columbus, Europe supposedly believed the Earth was flat, and only when he set sail was the truth of a spherical planet proven. Yet this is one of the clearest examples of how history was arranged, where fragments of memory were simplified, distorted, or pushed into darkness. First, the idea that medieval people thought the Earth was flat is actually a myth created much later. Since ancient Greece, scholars such as Pythagoras and Aristotle had already affirmed that the Earth was round, and astronomers in the Roman, Islamic, and Byzantine worlds carried this knowledge forward. Columbus was not proving the Earth was round, he was gambling that he could cross the Atlantic and reach Asia faster than the route through the Indian Ocean. In truth, he miscalculated. He had no idea that the Americas stood in the way. Yet official history turned this mistake into a heroic myth, painting him as the man who opened the age of global exploration. The second, less mentioned question is, what gave Columbus the confidence to believe he would find land after sailing west across the Atlantic? Some scholars have suggested that he may have known of unusual maps, what we now often call forbidden maps. Among the most famous is the Piri Reis map of 1513, created by an Ottoman admiral. What sparked controversy was not only its sketch of the South American coastline, but also its depiction of a southern landmass resembling Antarctica, though Antarctica was supposedly unknown until the 19th century. If Piri Reis were the only example, it could be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. But there are other maps, such as the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which also shows Antarctica's coastline without ice. These details have led many to ask, could there have been ancient sources of global knowledge, long lost or deliberately hidden, that Renaissance navigators only stumbled upon? If that were the case, Columbus and his contemporaries did not truly discover the Americas, but instead reconnected with roots already known in deep antiquity. Of course, mainstream historians reject such theories, arguing that the maps were merely patchworks of sailors' reports, imagination, and occasional errors. Yet even in this rebuttal, one question lingers. Why are artifacts such as the Piri Reis map pushed to the margins, labeled fringe instead of being studied seriously? Perhaps because they raise uncomfortable questions, questions that could undermine the official narrative of the so-called Age of Discovery. For if we accept that ancient sources of global geography once existed, the entire myth of Columbus changes. He is no longer the trailblazer, but simply the recycler of older knowledge. And with that, the Western historical arc, from the Age of Discovery to the Age of Enlightenment, loses some of its shine. This is why forbidden maps are not merely issues of archaeology or geography, they are questions of memory and power. Maps, in reality, have always been political tools. Whoever holds the map controls how the world is imagined. A line drawn across paper can legitimize conquest. A blank continent can justify claims of empty land. And when maps become myth, they do not only redraw geography, they redraw the memory of humanity. This reveals that even in the so-called Age of Enlightenment, history was carefully arranged. Columbus was made into legend, strange maps were set aside, and collective memory was shaped by a convenient story. Europe discovered, Europe conquered, Europe led the world. Maps, in this sense, were never just about navigation. They were instruments for crafting the memory of an entire civilization. But behind these stories still linger symbols, mysteries, and myths that never died, and among them none has haunted humanity more than Atlantis. Atlantis, a name that is at once legend and mirror, reflecting both what we have forgotten and perhaps what we have chosen to forget. More than 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato told the story of a vast island lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, where a wealthy and powerful people built grand structures and commanded a mighty navy. But in a single day and night of disaster, Atlantis sank beneath the sea, vanishing completely. Ever since, the tale of Atlantis has haunted humanity. Was it myth, or was it a memory buried deep in the sediments of time? The first thing to remember is that the only original source of Atlantis lies in two works by Plato, Timaeus and Critias. In them, he used the story of Atlantis to illustrate a philosophical argument, the contrast between an ideal society and a corrupt one. For this reason, many scholars believe Atlantis was merely a metaphor, a teaching device rather than a historical account. But what makes Atlantis unusual is that unlike purely mythical tales, Plato described it with striking detail, from circular city layouts and canal systems to its supposed geographical location. Such precision planted a seed of doubt. Perhaps Plato was not purely inventing, but drawing on some fragment of memory handed down from the distant past. Over the centuries, countless theories have been proposed about Atlantis's location. Some point to Crete, home of the Minoan civilization, which collapsed after the eruption of Thera around 1600 before the Common Era. Others have searched in Spain, North Africa, or even the middle of the Atlantic. Some have gone further still, suggesting Atlantis was a fading memory of a prehistoric global civilization that existed before the last ice age, only to be destroyed when rising seas swallowed its lands. None of these theories have been proven, yet they persist for one simple reason. No one can prove with certainty that Atlantis never existed. And even if Atlantis is nothing more than a symbol, it carries profound meaning. It reflects humanity's timeless fear that prosperity, power, and civilization can vanish in an instant. It also echoes the memory of real civilizations that once thrived but then disappeared from history, like the Hittites, Mohenjo-daro, or Ugarit we have already spoken of. Perhaps Atlantis was never a single place but a composite memory of many fallen civilizations, wrapped into one name and passed down as a warning across time. What is even more striking is how the Atlantis story has been reshaped in every era. During the Renaissance, it inspired explorers. In the modern era, it was tied to mystical movements and even racial theories. Today, it thrives in popular culture, in novels, films, and speculative theories on the fringes of science. Through all of this, Atlantis has never been just a tale about the past. It has been a mirror of the present, with each age rewriting it to suit its own needs and desires. So what ultimately is Atlantis? A philosophical symbol, a mythical memory, or a buried truth? Perhaps it is all of these things and not entirely any one of them. It exists like a void in humanity's memory, where fact and legend are woven so tightly together they cannot be separated. And it is precisely this ambiguity that makes Atlantis immortal, for human beings are always haunted by what cannot be fully known. Unlike Atlantis, which survives only in Plato's words, the Maya left us vast material evidence, towering pyramids hidden in the jungle, stone plazas, intricate carvings, and complex hieroglyphic inscriptions. And yet, paradoxically, even with all these remains, the Maya civilization still leaves behind a strange silence. In the 9th century, their great urban centers suddenly declined, and the memory of a brilliant culture was swallowed by the thick green forests, leaving behind quiet ruins that speak in stone instead of words. The Maya reached astonishing heights. They built cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan, with towering architecture rising above the jungle canopy, ceremonial plazas where thousands once gathered. They had a sophisticated system of hieroglyphic writing, astronomical knowledge so precise they could predict eclipses, and a calendar more advanced than that of many of their contemporaries. They developed art, sculpture, and a rich mythological world. And yet within a few generations many of their great cities were abandoned. Populations declined, buildings ceased, and Maya memory fell into a long silence lasting centuries. Why did such a dazzling civilization collapse? Many theories have been offered: climate change leading to prolonged drought, farmland overexploited until it could no longer sustain crops, constant warfare among city-states that weakened the entire system, but no single theory explains it all. Perhaps the Maya collapse was the result of many forces converging, a perfect storm of society, nature, and politics. Whatever the cause, what lingers most is the silence that followed. For centuries, the jungle devoured the Maya memory. Pyramids became hidden beneath trees, plazas turned into grassy mounds. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered surviving Maya communities, but they did not see, or did not want to see, the grandeur of the civilization that had come before. Instead of preserving it, they destroyed it. They burned thousands of Maya codices, leaving only 4 that survive today. Once again, memory was reduced to ash, and the silence deepened. It was not until the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists cut their way into the jungles, that the Maya re-emerged in human memory. They were astonished at the sight of pyramids rising from the wilderness like artificial mountains. But here lay another paradox. The Maya were revived not through their own voices, but through the eyes of outsiders. And in that revival they were transformed once again, not into a living civilization, but into a mysterious people, a romantic image in Western imagination, rather than a society with its own vibrant stories. The silence of the Maya teaches us something important. Memory does not only vanish in flames, it can also be covered by nature and forgotten by time. The great works may still stand, but if no one tells the story, if no one understands the language, they remain silent blocks of stone, and collective memory once again is left incomplete. While the Maya was swallowed by the jungle, the kingdom of Aksum in Africa was buried under the sands of time. Few remember that for centuries Aksum was counted among the four great powers of the ancient world, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and China. Situated in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, Aksum controlled the trade routes linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, holding gold, ivory, and other prized goods. And yet, in a striking paradox, a kingdom that once held immense power and influence has nearly vanished from collective memory, leaving behind only towering stone obelisks and scattered inscriptions. At its height, from the 1st to the 7th century of the Common Era, Aksum was an international hub of commerce. Its ships carried ivory, gold, and spices to India and the Arabian Peninsula. Aksumite gold coins bearing the images of its kings circulated widely and testified to its economic strength. Beyond trade, Aksum became one of the very first nations in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, as early as the 4th century, long before many European kingdoms. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela and the massive stelae, some rising dozens of meters into the sky, still stand as proof of the kingdom's creativity and spiritual authority. And yet, after the 7th century, Aksum declined. Trade routes shifted as the rise of Islam reshaped control over the Red Sea. Soil exhaustion caused by deforestation may have weakened agriculture. Pressures from neighboring kingdoms mounted. Gradually, the empire faded, its capital abandoned, and the name Aksum fell into silence. For centuries afterward, the outside world barely remembered it. In Europe, Ethiopia lived mostly as a legend, woven into the tale of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule in the East, more fiction than fact. What is striking is that while Rome and Persia left behind mountains of written records, Aksum left almost nothing beyond inscriptions in gaze and a few scattered texts. Its memory did not vanish because of a lack of achievement, but because there were too few to tell its story. When no one writes history, when no one copies and preserves it, even a mighty empire can be buried by time as though it never existed. Aksum's silence is not unique in Africa. The continent was home to many powerful states, Ghana, Mali, Great Zimbabwe, but their histories are too often retold through the eyes of outsiders, Arab merchants, Muslim chroniclers, or later European colonizers. As a result, Africa's place in world history is too often reduced, blurred, or pushed to the margins, remembered as periphery rather than center. The cost of that neglect is an imbalance in collective memory. We know volumes about Rome, yet very little about Aksum. We marvel at the pyramids of Egypt, while we too often overlook the towering stelae of Ethiopia. This forces us to ask, how many civilizations once flourished, only to leave behind too little for posterity to remember? Perhaps they built monuments, but the sands buried them. Perhaps they wrote texts, but the flames consumed them. Perhaps they spoke, but no one listened. And when memory vanishes in this way, the history of humanity becomes a distorted canvas, its brightest colors erased, leaving only shadows or lines drawn by the powerful. Aksum and other African empires reveal a sobering truth. Official history is not only what has been recorded, but also what has been ignored. Memory, like trade and power, is always shaped by centers of control. And when a land lies outside those centers, its memory is pushed to the margins or erased from the common map of humanity altogether. And when those memories are buried, the question of human origins grows even more uncertain. No name stirs more debate than Sumer. The Sumerians, often considered by scholars to be the beginning of recorded human history, remain one of the most fascinating and puzzling civilizations. Emerging between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 4000 to 3500 before the Common Era, Sumer quickly became one of the world's first urban societies. Here, they invented cuneiform writing, built city-states like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, developed systems of law, astronomy, and mathematics, and left behind the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving literary work known to humankind. But their very early rise forces a larger question: how could such a complex civilization appear so quickly after the Stone Age? Were they truly the beginning, or were they inheriting from a far older memory, one that humanity has since lost? The clay tablets of Sumer are both a treasure of knowledge and a source of endless debate. They record astronomical observations with remarkable accuracy, lunar cycles, planetary movements, and even astonishingly large numbers in the Sumerian king list. That list claims that before the Great Flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Was this purely mythological exaggeration, or could it be a faint echo of some forgotten prehistoric civilization? Mainstream historians often argue that these were symbolic numbers, meant to lend divine authority to the past. Yet the fact that similar flood stories exist across many cultures, from the biblical tale of Noah to the Indian legend of Manu, has led some to suggest a bold possibility. Perhaps there really was a global catastrophe remembered in collective human memory, and the Sumerians were simply among the first to rebuild afterward. The mystery deepens when we examine Sumerian writing itself. This is the earliest complete writing system known to humanity. And yet its sudden maturity leaves scholars puzzled. How could a community leap from oral tradition to fully developed cuneiform within only a few centuries? Was there an earlier, lost form of writing we have not yet found? Or, as some fringe theorists suggest, did the Sumerians somehow inherit an external memory, knowledge passed down from another civilization, or even from a source beyond our imagination? It is no surprise, then, that Sumer has become a focal point for alternative theories. Some independent researchers point to the Sumerian texts that describe the Anunnaki, beings from the sky, not as mythology, but as ancestral memory of an ancient encounter. While mainstream archaeology rejects this, the existence of such texts makes it difficult to dismiss the question entirely. What if there really is another layer of truth we have overlooked? What is certain is that the Sumerians left behind a legacy we cannot deny. From them came the idea of the city-state, of written laws, of organized trade, even the very system of measuring time in 60 seconds and 60 minutes. And yet, the abruptness of their rise and the mysteries surrounding them remind us that beginnings are never simple. Civilization does not spring from a single point, but from a broken chain of memories, many pieces missing, leaving us with an incomplete picture. The Sumerians, in this sense, are both a celebrated origin and a haunting reminder that we may have lost far more than we have preserved. They stand as a mirror to the fragility of human memory, forcing us to ask, were they truly the first, or merely the visible tip of a memory long buried beneath the sands of time? Buried memory is not only found in ancient civilizations long vanished. Sometimes it lies within our reach, yet hidden away or pushed to the margins. Two of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library, proved this point. They not only enriched our understanding of religion and the ancient world, but also raised an unsettling question. Why were these writings hidden for thousands of years, and who decided they should not become part of the official memory? In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd wandering near the Dead Sea tossed a stone into a cave and heard something shatter. Inside, he found clay jars holding aged leather scrolls. That chance moment marked the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a treasure trove of ancient Jewish writings dating from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. More than 900 manuscripts were eventually uncovered, including many copies of the Hebrew Bible, as well as texts that had never been seen before. They described the spiritual life, laws, and beliefs of a religious community, likely the Essenes. What made the Dead Sea Scrolls so significant was not only their religious value, but also the way they revealed diversity of thought in Judaism at the time. Instead of a single, unified vision, there were multiple perspectives and interpretations of scripture, law, and the role of a Messiah. In other words, during the very moment when Judaism and early Christianity were still taking shape, there were many versions of memory existing side by side. Yet for reasons we can only guess, most of these versions never became official. If these scrolls had not been sealed in caves, the religious history we know today might have been very different. Just 2 years earlier, in 1945, a group of Egyptian farmers unearthed clay jars near Nag Hammadi. Inside was a library of more than 50 early Christian texts written in Coptic. This was the Nag Hammadi Library, a treasure of Gnostic philosophy and theology. These writings offered a completely different vision of early Christianity. Instead of focusing on salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus, many emphasized inner knowledge, gnosis, as the true path to liberation. Some included Gospels no one had ever heard of before: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Together they posed a troubling question. Was Christianity from the very beginning a faith of many possible paths, with only one chosen as orthodox, while the rest were pushed aside? The Nag Hammadi texts showed that religious memory was never a simple straight line. It was a branching network. Over time, most of the branches were cut off, leaving only a single official stream. And when one of those forgotten branches suddenly reappears, it shakes the idea that history is fixed and unchanging. Both the Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi shared one striking feature. They had been deliberately hidden, as if someone knew they had to be protected from destruction. And they were uncovered in the very century when humanity began questioning official narratives more deeply than ever before. Perhaps they are like fragments of memory rising out of the collective subconscious, reminding us that history has never had just one version. Yet their very existence leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Why were they forgotten? Why did they have to wait 2,000 years before they could see the light again? Was there power at work that decided they did not fit the story humanity was meant to hear? And if other texts still lie buried beneath the sands or sealed in caves, how many more times will our memory of history change? Memory does not only vanish into stone or sand, sometimes it can be erased in plain sight, overshadowed by the rise of a new civilization. Forgetting does not always come from time or from nature. Sometimes it comes from those who inherit the legacy, those who both take from the past and erase the name of those who came before. The Etruscans are a powerful example of this. Once the masters of the Italian peninsula, their memory has been almost completely consumed by Rome, a civilization that built its greatness on Etruscan foundations, while allowing the people themselves to fade into silence. The Etruscans emerged around the 9th century before the Common Era, flourishing in central Italy, in the regions we now call Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria. They built cities, developed thriving trade networks, mastered advanced metallurgy, and created a complex religious culture. Before Rome rose to dominance, it was the Etruscans who held power. According to tradition, even the first kings of Rome were of Etruscan origin. The Romans inherited engineering techniques, religious rituals, divination practices, and even the architectural arch from them. And yet, paradoxically, while Rome borrowed the Etruscan legacy to build its empire, the memory of the Etruscans themselves disappeared. Once Rome conquered the entire peninsula, they defeated the Etruscans not only militarily, but also culturally. Etruscan writings, rare to begin with, were forgotten or destroyed. Their language, unique and unrelated to most other language families, gradually vanished, leaving behind only a few hundred short inscriptions, most of them funerary. If Etruscan historians ever wrote their own accounts, they are now completely lost. Instead, we know the Etruscans through Roman eyes. Writers like Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Tacitus described them through the lens of the defeated, either as a decadent people or as a stepping stone for the rise of Rome. Their achievements were absorbed, but their name was erased. In the collective memory, the Etruscans are not remembered as a civilization in their own right, but as a mere prelude to Rome. This makes the question, what did Rome hide, deeply unsettling. Did the Etruscans once have their own body of knowledge that could have reshaped our understanding of Roman origins? Did they have myths, philosophies, or religious systems that Rome reworked and rebranded as its own? When we look at the frescoed tombs of Tarquinia or the engineering projects Rome adopted, we cannot help but see traces of a civilization that was deliberately overshadowed. The greatest loss was their language. Unlike Greek or Latin, Etruscan was never passed down. Today we can only decipher fragments, not enough to read longer texts. Their voice has truly gone silent. And when the voice disappears, so does memory. Official history, written by Rome and its Western descendants, continued to obscure the Etruscans for centuries. Only in the 19th century, with the rise of archaeology, did the Etruscans begin to re-emerge, yet even then they were framed as mysterious, enigmatic, or undeciphered. That label itself is another form of concealment, reducing them not to equals in civilization, but to an anomaly, a puzzle on the margins of Western history. Here again we see a familiar pattern. Human memory is always told from the perspective of the victors. The Hittites vanished, the Maya fell silent, Axum was forgotten, and the Etruscans were covered by Rome. Each case is a reminder that history is never a neutral canvas. It is a product of selection, decisions about who will be remembered and who will be forgotten. And this raises a larger question: how many other Etruscans lie buried, unnamed beneath layers of earth, never spoken of? If even a people who shaped the very foundations of Rome could be erased from collective memory, then how many truths of history must still be missing in silence? Among the forgotten chapters of history, the Merovingian dynasty stands out. Unlike the Etruscans, who were overshadowed by Rome, the Merovingians were pushed out of medieval memory by feudal powers and the Western Church. They ruled the lands of the Franks, the foundation of modern France, from the 5th to the 8th century. And yet, when Europe's story is told, we hear only of Charlemagne, the Carolingians, or the later Capetian kings. The Merovingians slipped quietly into the shadows, leaving behind only legends of gold, bloodlines, and mysteries that have never been resolved. Their story begins with Clovis I, the Frankish king who converted to Christianity at the end of the 5th century. With that strategic decision, he secured not only political authority, but also the backing of the Roman Church. Under the Merovingians, the Frankish kingdom stretched across vast territories and laid the foundation for France itself. They were not petty rulers. They built one of the strongest kingdoms in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. And yet history remembers them with an almost mocking label, les rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. From the 7th century onward, real power shifted into the hands of palace officials, especially the mayor of the palace. It culminated in 751, when Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, deposed the last Merovingian king and established the Carolingian dynasty. From that point on, the Merovingians were erased from the official record. What remained was little more than a shadow, at times belittled, at other times transformed into legend. Within that shadow, 3 elements cling to the Merovingians: gold, bloodlines, and disappearance. First, the gold. Countless stories tell of the Merovingian treasure, coins, crowns, and regalia said to be hidden away, never fully discovered. Some suggest their wealth itself was their undoing, making them a target both for political rivals and for the church. Second, the bloodline. The Merovingians famously claimed they carried a sacred lineage. According to legend, their ancestor Merovech was born from a mysterious union between his mother and a sea creature known as the Quinator. From then on, the dynasty considered itself to possess a special blood distinct from other royal houses. This belief later fueled many theories, some linking the Merovingians to the myths of the Holy Grail, even to the controversial idea of a bloodline descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. While such claims lack hard evidence, the persistence of the legend reveals something deeper. In collective memory, the Merovingians still embody the idea of a hidden, forbidden bloodline. Finally, the disappearance. Unlike the Etruscans, who were buried beneath centuries of silence, the Merovingians faded away in an age when records were already being kept. And yet, they appear only faintly, as if deliberately dimmed in Europe's memory. Was this disappearance the result of a deliberate rewriting of history by the Carolingians and the Church, meant to legitimize their own power by erasing the dynasty that came before? What is fascinating is that the Merovingians never truly vanished. They re-emerged in legend, in esoteric writings, in works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and later in popular culture through novels like the Da Vinci Code. This half-light, part history, part myth, only made them more intriguing. The more they were hidden, the more they provoked curiosity. From tales of bloodlines and gold, the story unfolds into another name forever entwined with legend, the Knights Templar. If the Merovingians evoke the memory of a dynasty shrouded in darkness, the Templars stand as a symbol of that strange intersection where power, treasure, and myth blur into one another. Few organizations in history have combined such undeniable influence with so many layers of mystery until the line between fact and fiction becomes almost impossible to draw. The Order of the Temple was founded in 1119 in the aftermath of the First Crusade. At first, they were little more than a small band of knights who swore to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Yet with papal approval and royal patronage, they expanded rapidly, becoming one of the most formidable military and financial powers of the medieval world. Their fortresses rose across Europe and the Middle East. They were not merely warriors, but the architects of the world's first international banking system, safeguarding deposits, issuing credit, and operating a network of finance so sophisticated that even kings were dependent on their services. It was this economic power, more than their military might, that sealed their fate. Under King Philip IV of France, weighed down by enormous debts to the order, the crown struck back. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, a date that would echo as ominous ever since, Templars across France were arrested in a sudden, coordinated operation. Tortured into confessions of idolatry, heresy, and blasphemy, they were condemned. With the cooperation of Pope Clement V, the Templars were dissolved, their lands seized, and their leaders executed. And yet a void remained. The vast treasure of the Templars, their gold, their sacred relics, even rumoured secret texts, was never fully recovered. Some of their holdings were confiscated, but much simply vanished. Out of this silence, legends multiplied. Some claimed the Templars smuggled their wealth to Scotland. Others whispered that they carried the Holy Grail itself, or safeguarded the secret of the sacred bloodline. Still others believed they unearthed hidden scriptures beneath the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. The lack of evidence only deepened the fascination, leaving room for endless speculation. Over the centuries, the Templars became a canvas for theories both serious and fantastic. Some historians see them as preservers of ancient wisdom, bridging Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. Others imagine them as the seed of later secret societies, such as the Freemasons. Modern culture, from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, to the Da Vinci Code, has only intensified their mythic aura, turning them into symbols of forbidden knowledge and hidden truth. Yet beneath the legends lies a much simpler truth. The Templars were destroyed not because of heresy, but because of wealth and power. They had become too rich, too strong, and too independent to remain under royal or papal control. When authority needed a justification for their destruction, it crafted a convenient narrative. The Templars were heretics, idolaters, enemies of the faith. By branding them as such, their suppression could be cast as holy justice rather than political theft. This was perhaps the greatest distortion of all, an order once praised as the warriors of God, condemned overnight as servants of the devil. A reminder that in history, the line between memory and manipulation is thin, and often written by those with the most to gain. And here we see a familiar pattern. Whatever proves too difficult to control is often reshaped or erased by official history. From the Templars of medieval Europe, we step into the early modern era and encounter another name wrapped in clouds of controversy: Tartaria. On European maps from the 16th to the 19th centuries, this vast expanse stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe appears clearly under that title. The word Tartaria was printed as though it referred to a mighty empire or a grand civilization. Yet when we turn to official historical records, we find almost no trace of a Tartarian empire at all. So what was Tartaria? A myth? A vague label used by Western cartographers? Or a fragment of memory deliberately erased from the official canvas of history? Tartaria appears on countless old maps, Mercator, Bleu, and other 17th century atlases. It was described as a territory so immense that geographers often divided it into Great Tartary, Little Tartary, or Chinese Tartary. To European eyes at the time, Tartaria was not fantasy, it was reality. Yet the problem is this: Tartaria had no clearly defined political structure, no dynasty, no official chronicles to anchor it. It existed like a shadow, present on maps, absent in recorded memory. Mainstream historians explain it this way: Tartaria was simply a collective label Europeans used for the nomadic peoples of Central Asia and Siberia, Mongols, Turkic tribes, and many others, lumped together under one convenient name. As maps became more precise and empires like Russia and China expanded across the region, the name Tartaria disappeared, replaced by modern nation-states. By this reasoning, Tartaria was never a unified empire at all, but a European invention born of limited knowledge. But those who believe in the Tartarian mystery reject that explanation. They argue that the disappearance of the name was far too abrupt, coinciding precisely with the rise of Russian and Chinese power in Central Asia. Could it be that a real civilization once stood there, only to be erased by two expanding empires eager to claim the land and rewrite the past? Some even take this further, proposing that Tartaria was once an advanced civilization with architecture and technology beyond its time, silenced and hidden in order to preserve Europe's narrative of progress and supremacy. Followers of the Tartarian theory often point to clues: monumental neoclassical architecture in Russia, Central Asia, and even North America. They claim such grand buildings could not possibly have been constructed in the 18th or 19th centuries within such short spans of time. Instead, they suggest these are remnants of Tartaria, rebranded as European creations once the civilization was wiped away. Archaeologists and architectural historians counter that these works are simply products of European neoclassicism. Yet the uncanny similarities across continents continue to fuel speculation. So what, ultimately, is Tartaria? Perhaps it is both myth and mirror, a reflection of our deep human need for forgotten memories. In a world where history is so often written by the powerful, gaps like Tartaria become fertile ground for imagination. Maybe it was never the mighty empire conspiracy theories describe, but its sudden disappearance from maps and memory makes it difficult to accept that it was merely a cartographic mistake. What matters more is what the debate itself reveals. We will never have a complete history. Every map, every text, every archaeological fragment is only one piece of a larger puzzle, and when a piece as vast as Tartaria is discarded, the picture that remains will always feel incomplete. That incompleteness breeds myths. Whether Tartaria was real or imagined, its ghost lingers as a reminder that memory can be cut short, not only by choice, but also by forces we cannot control. Forces like war, conquest, and above all, disease. Not every gap in memory comes from maps erased or manuscripts lost. Some gaps are carved directly into society itself, when millions of lives vanish and collective memory is cut short. These are the voids created by plagues, terrifying forces unlike any other, capable of silencing an entire civilization in only a few years. Wars can level cities, natural disasters can ruin harvests, but plagues can erase people themselves, and with them, memory and time. In that silence, history feels as if it has swallowed whole chapters, leaving behind shadows that nothing can ever truly fill. The first name that usually rises in our shared memory is the Black Death of the 14th century. In less than a decade, the bubonic plague killed nearly 1/3 of Europe's population, half in some places. Thriving cities turned into graveyards, villages fell silent, and the memory of an entire generation was nearly wiped clean. With no one left to tell stories or record events, vast regions became landscapes of silence. The documents that remain speak of panic, despair, and the fear of divine punishment. But behind those fragile pages lies a deeper reality. Countless personal memories, family histories, and community traditions vanished forever, leaving an emptiness that can never be restored. Long before this, during the Roman Empire, the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century carved similar dark voids. These outbreaks did not only take lives, they shook the very structure of the empire. Many historians now believe that these epidemics played a crucial role in Rome's decline, though official chronicles rarely highlight them. Why? Because plagues do not leave behind victories, nor heroes to be celebrated. They leave only the silence of death, and silence is difficult to fit into the triumphal language of history. In the New World, the silence ran even deeper. When Europeans set foot in the Americas, diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread faster than any army could march. Tens of millions of indigenous people died within a few decades, perhaps as much as 90% of the population. Entire communities, languages, and memories were extinguished before anyone had the chance to record them. Later generations looked at abandoned cities like Tenochtitlan, or at the ruins of the Maya and Inca, and often attributed their collapse to military conquest. Yet the greatest destroyer was not the sword, it was disease. A whole continent was silenced, allowing official history to be rewritten in the voice of the conqueror. What is most striking is that plagues create a unique kind of silence, the silence of memory that never had the chance to be passed on. When an entire generation dies all at once, personal stories, lived experience, songs and myths vanish too. With no written records and no voices left, only emptiness remains. That is why history often skips over these moments as if they were temporary interruptions, when in truth they were deep fractures in humanity's memory. And yet within that silence lies a paradox. Plagues not only destroy, they sometimes open the door to change. The Black Death, devastating as it was, accelerated the decline of European feudalism. With so many dead, labor became scarce and more valuable, shifting power in ways no one could have predicted. But those changes were told only from the perspective of survivors. The memories of the dead, the overwhelming majority, were lost forever, leaving no voice in the record. In this sense, plague is the quietest author of history. It raises no monuments, it leaves behind no victories, yet it erases human memory more completely than any war. And when future generations look back, what they find is not presence but absence, a blurred chapter of history covered by silence itself. Not every silence in history is carved by nature. Human beings have their own ways of making the past fall silent through censorship of science and knowledge. If plague creates voids by wiping out entire populations, censorship produces another kind of void, one where ideas are strangled before they can fully emerge. Not every loss in history is caused by disaster. Often it is power, fear, or profit that deliberately suffocates new thought. And when knowledge is buried in this way, humanity loses its chance to glimpse another path, one that might have been brighter, broader, and freer. The clearest examples come from Europe during the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Galileo Galilei, often called the father of modern science, stood before the Inquisition in 1633 for daring to support the heliocentric model of Copernicus. A century earlier, even Copernicus had hesitated to publish De Revolutionibus, delaying until the end of his life. Not because he doubted his own discovery, but because he understood the power of censorship. To challenge theological foundations was to risk erasure, not just of ideas, but of one's own life. Galileo was forced to recant, condemned to spend his final years under house arrest. For centuries afterward, the official memory of Europe still clung to the geocentric universe. Only with time and the persistence of later generations did that memory shift. But imagine if Galileo had been free to teach, if Copernicus had been embraced instead of silenced. Europe might have entered the Enlightenment centuries earlier. And it was not only astronomy. Censorship reached into medicine, biology, and philosophy. Paracelsus, who challenged scholastic medicine, was dismissed as a madman. Giordano Bruno, who envisioned an infinite cosmos filled with countless worlds, was burned alive in Rome in 1600. His knowledge did not disappear, but it was suffocated for centuries until posterity could remember him only as a martyr to free thought. Nor was censorship the domain of the Church alone. In the modern era, political and economic systems have buried ideas just as effectively. Inventions in alternative energy have been shelved because they threatened the oil industry. Research on environmental destruction has been suppressed because it endangered powerful corporations. Philosophical and social theories have been excluded from education because they challenged ruling ideologies. Here, censorship does not burn scientists at the stake, but it burns away the influence of their work before it ever has a chance to change the world. The most dangerous part is this. When knowledge is censored, future generations often never even know it existed. A plague at least leaves empty villages and mass graves, traces that force us to ask questions. But censorship erases silently, leaving no ruins, no scars, no evidence that an idea ever lived. History then appears as a story of smooth progression, as if the accepted path was the only one. The truth, however, is that many paths once lay before us and were deliberately erased. Censorship is one of the quietest enemies of memory. It does not roar with violence, it whispers with silence. It shapes history into a one-way narrative where alternatives are forgotten. And when we look back, we imagine that the past had no other direction, when in reality it may have held many roads we will never see. Yet history has its way of restoring voices once silenced. Galileo's name was eventually cleared. Bruno became a symbol. The Gnostic Gospels hidden at Nag Hammadi resurfaced. Libraries once burned are now remembered as wounds in our collective memory. Though it comes late, memory has the ability to heal itself. And this offers a fragile hope that no truth disappears forever. It only waits, hidden, until humanity is ready to listen again. But if memory can resurface, it raises a deeper question. Who decides which memories are preserved and which are erased? In other words, who truly benefits from a rewritten history? The most obvious answer is the victors of war: Rome over Carthage, Spain over the Aztec and Inca, or the many European empires over their colonies. By rewriting history, the winners did more than erase the memory of the defeated. They cast themselves in a halo of righteousness. Their power was reinforced not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of future generations. Children grew up believing that the victors were always the more civilized, the more just, and from that belief, domination became natural. Religion also claimed its share of control. For centuries, the Christian Church in Europe oversaw the writing, copying, and preservation of knowledge. Texts that fit doctrine were copied and taught. Those that contradicted it were burned, buried, or branded heretical. The result was not a complete picture of knowledge, but a carefully filtered version. Who benefited? Those who claimed the right to define truth. By shaping the past, they also defined the spiritual future of entire communities. Dynasties and royal houses also reaped the rewards. In many nations, history was rewritten to legitimize the ruling bloodline. In China, each new dynasty wrote the history of the one before it, often casting its predecessors as corrupt or weak to emphasize its own mandate. In Europe, political marriages and myths of divine descent were crafted to strengthen thrones. Who gained? Those seated upon them. Ordinary rulers recast as the destiny of nations. Even in the modern age, rewritten history serves nations themselves. School textbooks are rarely neutral. They are carefully curated to instill pride, foster unity, and shape how citizens view their collective past. Who benefits? The state, which gains an invisible but powerful tool to preserve stability. Yet in this process, the complex layers of human memory are simplified, distorted, or erased altogether. Still, rewriting history does not always serve only the powerful. At times, marginalized communities reclaim their stories as a way to resist erasure. Indigenous movements in the Americas, Africa, and Asia are reviving traditions and narratives that official history once pushed aside. In this case, who benefits? Those who were once silenced, now reclaiming their voices. This reminds us that rewriting history is not only an instrument of control, it can also be a tool of survival, a way for forgotten voices to rise again from the margins of silence. And from here, a deeper question emerges. What if history had unfolded differently? What if the erased memories had survived, the censored knowledge had been allowed to breathe, the silenced voices had been heard? Would humanity have walked a very different road? This is not a mere exercise in fantasy. It is a way of confronting the very nature of history itself. It has never been inevitable. It is not a single straight path, but a series of crossroads. Choices taken, accidents endured, silences imposed. Imagine if the Library of Alexandria had not burned. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls on mathematics, astronomy, medicine from Egypt, Greece, India, and Babylon might have survived. Science could have leapt centuries ahead of its time with discoveries that today we cannot even imagine. Perhaps technology would have flourished far earlier, but so too might weapons of mass destruction. History might then have been marked by wars even more catastrophic than those we already know. Imagine if the Etruscans had not been buried beneath Rome's shadow. Europe might not have been bound so tightly to a Greco-Roman myth of origin. Instead, another civilization with its own language, philosophies, and worldview might have shaped the foundations of the West. In that version of history, Rome might not stand alone as the cornerstone of Europe's identity. Imagine if the Merovingians had not been erased, if their bloodline and legends had been acknowledged. France, and perhaps Western Christendom itself, could have developed along entirely different lines. A sacred lineage, if truly embraced, might have fractured the Church's monopoly on power, leading to political and spiritual diversity instead of uniformity. But history moved in the opposite direction. Centralization of authority, narrowing of memory, suppression of variety. Imagine if Tartaria had truly been a great empire, and if its memory had not been erased. The political map of Eurasia today would look entirely different. Russia and China might not dominate the region as they do now. The nomadic peoples once collapsed under the vague label of Tartars could have held a more prominent voice in global history. But with the erasure of that memory, they remain spectral, reduced to fragments of folklore. Even disease plays its part. What if plague had not cut down millions, severing lines of memory before they could be passed on? How many languages, songs, myths, and bodies of knowledge disappeared forever when entire communities were wiped out? Had those memories endured, humanity might have inherited richer cultural landscapes, more varied worldviews, not so wholly dominated by a few surviving centers of power. And here lies the paradox: the more branches of history that vanish, the more inevitable the surviving path appears. Because the alternatives have been silenced, the road that remains is mistaken for destiny. We grow accustomed to believing things had to be this way, but they did not. To imagine what if history had been different is not to deny the present, but to expand our vision. It humbles us, reminding us that the world we inhabit is only one version among many that could have been. It also offers hope. If memory can be darkened, it can also be illuminated again. Forgotten voices may still return. Lost truths may still reshape the way we see both past and future. Perhaps the real significance does not lie in picturing a completely different world, but in recognizing that the world could have been different. That simple truth is enough to remind us history is alive, never complete, never final. Memory may be buried, distorted, or silenced, but it always carries the possibility of return, a possibility strong enough to change how we see the present and how we imagine what is still to come. And so our journey approaches its end. After all the questions, the silences, the erased civilizations, and the rewritten myths, one truth remains. History is never a finished portrait. It is always a broken mosaic, and our task is to keep searching, to keep asking, so that the light is never extinguished completely. After peeling back all those buried layers of memory, from vanished civilizations, burned manuscripts to dynasties cast into shadow, we are left with one simple but profound truth. History has never been a clear mirror. It is cracked and fractured, reflecting both light and darkness, often bent by the hands of power. The final question is not where does absolute truth lie, but rather do we dare to look back into that mirror of history? To dare is to embrace discomfort, to face the shadows we were once taught to forget. Yet in that act of looking back we discover diversity, richness, and the forgotten voices, the very essence of what makes us human. And now, I would love to hear from you. After today's episode, what do you think? Is the history we know the truth, or merely a rewritten version of it? Share your thoughts below, and if you feel this is a journey worth continuing, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, so together we can uncover more of the hidden secrets that linger in the shadows of the past.